A missionary is somebody that is willing to cross cultural, social, some kind of boundary that is major in their lives. So it's moving from one place to another place to take the gospel typically where it has not been heard or is not. God is there, but the gospel's not there. It needs to be communicated, and so a missionary takes the gospel to that place. Well, for me, missions wasn't something that was foreign at all. My grandparents were missionaries. My parents were missionaries. In fact, I was born overseas. And so as God was working in my life to bring me to that point, all the way back in high school, I knew I was supposed to go into ministry. And then in college, I met my wife, or the woman who was going to be my wife, and she had this passion to be overseas. And God began to use that in my life because I knew I wanted to do ministry. I knew I wanted to be where the gospel wasn't. And as God brought us together and brought us closer to Him, we both realized we needed to be where the gospel was not, where the gospel had not been preached. And so God used that relationship. He used what He was doing in our lives to take us to that place. You know, so much of what we do overseas is starting the first church, at least where we worked. And if you don't have a good theological background, the DNA that you set is going to be the DNA for the next 10, 15, 20 years of that church. And if you don't have a good background, how are you going to set a good DNA? How are you going to set theological principles and understanding of the gospel without a good understanding of what the gospel is and what it has to say? I always tell students and different ones who are anxious to get overseas, if Jesus comes back today and you're preparing to go overseas to be a missionary, He's not going to say, why didn't you go right now? He's going to say, well done, my good and faithful servant, because you're preparing, you're getting ready to help people understand the truth and the depth of the gospel. What should you be doing right now to get ready to go overseas? Well, I like to tell people they need to be doing three things. First of all, they need to be sharing Jesus with people. We like to think that when I go overseas, I'm this great evangelist. Well, for a week you are, but it's more than being overseas for a week. It's being overseas for a lifetime. So you need to set that in your life right now. How do I share the gospel every day with people? The second thing I think you need to be doing is you need to be looking at, how do I start a Bible study in my home? Most of missions is starting Bible studies in your home. So how do you do that in your own culture? Because when you get into a new culture, man, it's all that much more difficult. But if you've learned how to do it in your culture, then it'll be that much easier. And then the third thing is you need to develop relationships with internationals. They think different. They are different. They come from a different cultural background. Learn that cultural background, even if that's not where you're going to work. Learn how to relate to internationals, how to love them and serve them and be Jesus to them. And then the last thing is work on your marriage and your spiritual life. If those things aren't solid when you go, you're just going to have a really hard time overseas. Short-term missions is just vital to who we are as ministers. The world's flat. People go all over the world today. And we need to understand cultural norms and values and how people think and how they're different from us. And there is something about being overseas that gives us a heart for the nations as God has a heart for the nations. So we need to be overseas. All of us need to be overseas at one point or another. And if we're never overseas, how do we understand the missionaries that we send? How do we understand what they're going through every day? How do we understand what their lives are like if we're not there with them?